Good day, students. Today we will be doing a reading story in our Reading Street book called Grace for President. Grace for President is a story that takes place in a school of a young girl who would like to run for class president. So, this is a story that helps us to understand how the voting process works and how we choose presidents and leaders. So, we are going to go straight into our story, but just before that, we have to look at some words that will come across in our story that we might not understand. So we have these words, these frequently used words in our story, which are microphone, slogan, rallies, speeches, election, and assembly. A microphone, as we know, is a device that is used that we speak in so that many people can hear us, and it is heard over speakers, big speakers that can be heard out loud. A slogan is like a saying or a few words that people can remember, like a catchy phrase. And rallies and speeches go together because we have speeches at rallies, and a rally is basically where we try and convince people to vote for us if we are running for a leader or president and so forth. With that said, after the rallies and the speeches, people have an election. An election is where we choose and vote for a leader. An assembly is a gathering of people to listen to someone speak and so forth. So, with this said, in our Readers and Writers Notebook, we will find these words, these frequently used words in our Readers and Writers Notebook on page 530. We are going to go straight into our recording of um, our story today, and then we will have a look at the activity and then our homework.
Grace for President by Kelly DiPuccio. Illustrated by Le Pham. Genre: realistic fiction tells about made-up events that could happen in real life. Now read about a pretend election at a school. Question of the week: how are different traditions celebrated and shared? One morning in September, Mrs. Barrington rolled out a big poster with all of the president's pictures on it. Grace Campbell could not believe her eyes. Where are the girls? That is a very good question, said Mrs. Barrington. The truth is, our country has never had a woman president. No girl president? Ever? Grace asked. No, I'm afraid not, said Mrs. Barrington. Grace sat at her desk and stewed. No girls? Who'd ever heard of such a crazy thing? Finally, she raised her hand. Yes, Grace? I've been thinking it over, and I'd like to be president. Several students in the class laughed. Well, I think that's a star-spangled idea, Grace, said Mrs. Barrington. In fact, we can have our own election right here at Woodrow Wilson Elementary. The snickering in the room stopped. Grace smiled. Would anyone else like to run for president? Mrs. Barrington asked the class. Nobody raised their hand. Becoming president was going to be easy, Grace thought. The next day, Mrs. Barrington made an announcement. In the name of democracy, I have invited Mr. Waller's class to join our election. Their class has nominated Thomas Cobb to be their presidential candidate. Grace's heart sank. Thomas was the school spelling bee champion. His experiments always took a blue ribbon at the science fair. And he was captain of the soccer team. Becoming president wasn't going to be so easy after all, Grace thought. The teachers put the names of all 50 states and the District of Columbia into a hat. Everyone except for Grace and Thomas got to choose a state. "I'm Texas," said Anthony. "I'm New Hampshire," said Rose. "I'm Michigan," said Robbie. "What does the number 17 mean?" Each state is assigned a number of electoral votes. That number is determined by how many people live in that state, said Mrs. Barrington. Each of you will be a representative for your state. Altogether, our country has 538 electoral votes, Mr. Waller explained. On Election Day, the candidate who receives 270 electoral votes or more wins the election. "Why 270?" asked Rose. "That's more than half of all the electoral votes," Mr. Waller said. Becoming president really wasn't going to be so easy, Grace thought. Grace came up with a campaign slogan. Thomas came up with his own campaign slogan. "Make history. Vote Grace Campbell for president." "Vote for Thomas Cobb, the best man for the job." Grace listened to what issues were important to the students, and she made a list of campaign promises. A peaceful school. No bullies. A cleaner school. No littering. Better hot lunches. No more fish stick tacos. Thomas made up his own list of promises. Free tutoring. Free soccer lessons. Fish stick tacos every week. Grace made campaign posters and buttons. Thomas made posters and buttons too. Each week, the teachers set aside time for the candidates to meet with their constituents. Polls were taken. Voters were making their choices. Grace continued to campaign. At recess, she gave speeches. During lunch, she handed out free cupcakes. After school, she held rallies. Meanwhile, Thomas wasn't worried. He had cleverly calculated that the boys held slightly more electoral votes than the girls. At recess, Thomas studied his spelling words. During lunch, he worked on his latest science experiment. After school, he played soccer. Even before the election, Grace made good on her promises. She joined the safety squad. She organized a school beautification committee, and she volunteered her time in the school cafeteria. In early November, Woodrow Wilson Elementary hosted a special Election Day assembly. Grace and Thomas took their places on stage as the school band began to play. Henry was the first representative to approach the microphone. The Yellowhammer State of Alabama casts its 9 electoral votes for Thomas Cobb, Fletcher said. The last frontier state of Alaska casts its 3 electoral votes for the best man for the job, Thomas Cobb. Hannah called out, "The Grand Canyon state of Arizona casts its 10 electoral votes for Grace Campbell." And so it went. State after state after state cast their electoral votes. The scoreboard in the gymnasium kept track of the totals. The voting demonstration was quickly coming to an end. Clara approached the podium. The Badger State of Wisconsin casts its 10 votes for my best friend, Grace Campbell. Grace looked at the scoreboard. Thomas had 268 electoral votes. She had 267. There was only one state still unaccounted for: Wyoming. Thomas grinned. Grace felt sick. Sam walked up to the microphone. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Grace. He looked down at Grace's handmade flag. Sam didn't say a word. "What are you waiting for?" Thomas whispered. The band stopped playing. All eyes were on Wyoming. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. "The equality state of Wyoming casts its 3 electoral votes for Grace Campbell." The gymnasium erupted in loud cheers and a few boos. Mrs. Barrington approached the podium. "With 270 electoral votes, the winner is Grace Campbell." Thomas looked stunned. Grace hugged Sam. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Sam handed Grace his flag. "Because," he said, "I thought you were the best person for the job." The following week, the students in Mrs. Barrington's class were preparing for their career day presentations. Grace volunteered to go first. She stood at the front of the room and glanced at the poster still hanging on the wall. "My name is Grace Campbell, and when I grow up, I'm going to be President of the United States." This time, everyone believed that she would.
And that is a very good story of how elections take place, even though we don't have elections in all parts of the world for presidents and so forth. But this is a very good idea of what we do or what should be done when we are having our elections. So with that said, we're going to finish up with our activities. Now, activity on page 530, and there we have a block full of words with the high frequency words in it: microphone, slogan, rallies, speeches, election, assembly. And these are the answers for our activity, which is, our first answer is assembly. Carlos spoke at the school assembly. Assembly is when everyone is coming together and someone is speaking, right? So assembly for the first answer. The second one, he spoke right into the microphone. The microphone helps us to speak louder through the speakers, and as his teacher had taught him. Carlos was running for president in the school election. Election is the third answer there on page 530 in our Readers and Writers Notebook. And with that said, all students running for presidents made speeches. Speeches is where you are trying to speak to everyone across the microphone. Everyone can hear you and you are convincing everyone to vote for you. Carlos had already spent hours speaking at rallies. Rallies is the specific place where you can have your speeches and you can try and accumulate some people that can vote for you. And he and his neighbor had written his slogans for the last answer on that page of 530. And with that said, we have our homework, Readers and Writers Notebook on page 534. And just a reminder of today's test that we have for English. You can have some revision time on page 439, page 497, page 511 for the grammar section of this test that we will be writing, and spelling revision would be for page 425, 437, and page 509. And this is the end of the session. Thank you.